Ruby Whittaker cleaned Harvard's classrooms in silence. Invisible, dismissed, erased. Until one night, she solved a graduate-level math problem on a chalkboard and left it behind. By morning, professors were speechless. But instead of praise, they called security. Because the girl who cracked the unsolvable wasn't a student. She was the janitor. And what Harvard did next? It wasn't denial. It was erasure. But Ruby had a notebook, and it held the truth they couldn't bury. Not this time. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Long after Harvard's towering lecture halls emptied for the night, and the final heels clicked across the cobbled courtyard, a faint hum of wheels echoed in the math building. It wasn't the sound of brilliance or prestige, but of a mop bucket, sloshing back and forth as it rolled across centuries-old floors. Ruby Whittaker moved silently, her worn sneakers absorbing the cold from the marble tiles beneath her. Her uniform was too large, a faded gray set with her name stitched in crooked thread. No one looked twice at her in daylight. But at night, surrounded by chalk-stained boards and crumpled brilliance, Ruby was exactly where she wanted to be. She'd been working as a night janitor for nearly 2 years. Officially, she was responsible for cleaning 4 academic buildings. Unofficially, she spent those hours absorbing discarded genius. Lecture notes left behind, equations half-solved, textbooks left open mid-thought. To most janitors, trash. To Ruby, treasure. Ruby didn't talk much. The few who crossed her path often made assumptions about her intelligence, her background, her purpose, but Ruby listened. Always listened. She had memorized entire lectures from behind the glass walls of advanced classrooms, mouthing formulas to herself as she wiped down desks. At first, she had tried to ask questions. That didn't last long. 3 semesters ago, she asked a postdoc how to solve a vector field problem she'd seen on the board. He looked her up and down and laughed, told her to stick to SOAP, not slope. She never asked again. But she didn't need to. Ruby had a different classroom now, one built on scraps and silence. Every night, she cleaned room 4C first, the main math lecture hall. There, Professor Levington taught differential geometry, a subject so advanced most undergrads couldn't pronounce it. Levington was infamous for his icy demeanor, arrogant lectures, and his firm belief in academic hierarchy. Students feared him, staff avoided him. Ruby watched him. She arrived every night minutes after he left, her eyes darting across boards still smudged with fresh chalk. She'd snap photos on her flip phone, then spend hours deciphering the symbols at home, sometimes falling asleep with her notebooks open across her chest. What others saw as equations, Ruby saw as language, a coded world she could step into, where status didn't matter, only logic. But no matter how sharp her mind, she never let anyone see. Not until the night of October 18th. That night, Ruby stayed longer in 4C, too engrossed in an unsolved equation to finish her rounds on time. It was an open problem from the lecture that day, a twisted 6-variable integral no one had managed to solve. Levington had scoffed at his class when no one got close. "It's not meant for underdeveloped minds," he had said. The quote was still etched in chalk. Ruby stared at the board, heart pounding. Her hands trembled as she picked up the chalk. She didn't just want to solve it. She knew she could. She felt the numbers move in her head, like puzzle pieces snapping into place. For 20 breathless minutes, her strokes were precise, furious. When she was done, she stood back, eyes wide. It was elegant, symmetrical, perfect. She took a picture, then erased the entire board. No one could know. No one ever believed her. As she packed her cart and began heading toward the next building, she didn't notice the janitor's trash bin behind her had snagged something. A crumpled set of notes covered in formulas and doodles. It was her own work from earlier, now mixed with other discarded pages, left exposed. Back in his office, Professor Levington was grading late assignments when he realized he had misplaced a folder. Annoyed, he retraced his steps to room 4C, hoping to find it before the cleaning staff locked up. He entered the hallway and spotted Ruby's cart down the corridor. She wasn't around. Curious, or perhaps driven by an unconscious suspicion, Levington peeked inside the trash bin. Among banana peels and used latex gloves, he saw math notes, intricate notes. He pulled out a page, then another, and another. He stopped breathing. The handwriting was messy but meticulous. The logic was flawless. It wasn't just copied work, it was original thinking. He read the name at the top, Ruby. His hands trembled as he dropped the pages back into the bin, unsure what he'd just discovered. But what caught his eye next, scribbled on the back of one sheet, wasn't just a solution. It was a theory that contradicted his own published work. Ruby Whittaker had never owned much. No car, no college degree, no framed accolades. But she had that notebook. Its cracked leather cover had once been her grandmother's prayer journal, now repurposed into a maze of high-level equations, scrawled proofs and theoretical musing, tucked under the lowest shelf of her cleaning cart, hidden beneath rags and disinfectants. It lived there like a buried artifact, waiting for the world to notice it. But no one ever did. She wrote in it every night after her shift, often while sitting cross-legged on the floor of the supply closet, the humming of the building's ancient boiler her only soundtrack. The notebook was her classroom, her therapy, her rebellion. Each page was an act of silent defiance, a refusal to believe that brilliance had to wear a blazer or speak in a certain tone. Her entries weren't random. They followed the lecture schedule of Professor Levington's course. Not because she was enrolled. She wasn't even allowed to sit in. But Ruby had memorized the syllabus, and she built her world around it. Where others saw her as part of the custodial crew, she saw herself as auditing the most elite math course in the country, one chalk-stained floor at a time. But in recent weeks, her equations had become something more. Sharper. Riskier. She was no longer just solving problems from class. She was challenging them, modifying theories, questioning the very frameworks her invisible professors revered. And the more she wrote, the more one truth rose to the surface. She was starting to outpace them. Yet no one would believe it. Not here, not at Harvard. Earlier that same day, Ruby had overheard a conversation while cleaning a faculty lounge. Two graduate students discussing how only people with the right pedigree ever got published. One laughed, adding, "It's not racism, it's just reality. Who's gonna take a janitor seriously, even if she cracked the Riemann hypothesis?" They didn't know she was listening. But even if they had, they wouldn't have imagined she understood. That was the magic and curse of invisibility. Still, their words hung with her as she rolled her cart into 4C that evening. Room 4C had become her sanctuary and her battleground. Tonight, the chalkboard was filled with the remnants of another Levington ego trip. An open-ended equation he claimed only a savant would even attempt. The classroom was empty, the heat low, the air still smelling of whiteboard cleaner and arrogance. Ruby stared at the equation. It pulsed in her mind like a dare. She hesitated for a moment, then reached into the cart, brushed aside a rag, and retrieved the notebook. Kneeling at the edge of the board, she began to write. Her eyes narrowed, fingers flying, not stopping to second-guess herself. Every mark she made pushed harder against the walls society had built around her. And she didn't just solve the problem, she transformed it. Half an hour later, the board bore no trace of the unsolved mess Levington had left. In its place stood a complete proof, sharp, poetic, airtight, the kind of solution that changed careers. She stared at it, something inside her burned. A mixture of fear, pride, and a rebellious thrill she didn't know she was allowed to feel. She took out her phone, snapped a photo for her records, and for the first time ever walked away without erasing the board. What she didn't know was that someone else had seen her. A camera newly installed for lecture capture testing had been running. Though it wasn't yet connected to the main server, a student technician named Carter Bowman had forgotten to turn it off. He was reviewing footage to test audio levels when he caught a glimpse of a woman in janitor's clothes moving swiftly, chalk in hand. He leaned closer. Carter wasn't a math genius, but he recognized the equation, and what she'd done to it. At first he assumed it was a prank, maybe some experimental art. But the more he watched, the more he realized it wasn't just authentic, it was brilliant. He replayed the footage, pausing at her face. She didn't look like a grad student. She didn't wear a badge. He'd seen her before, wiping windows, pushing a mop. His stomach sank. Back in her apartment, a cramped room above a laundromat, Ruby curled up with her notebook, fingers stained with chalk dust. She replayed the solution in her mind, line by line. Her work wasn't perfect, but it was hers. For a moment she wondered if she'd gone too far. Leaving the solution on the board, that wasn't like her. But something about that night, the equation, the quiet, the voices in her head telling her she didn't belong, it lit a fire. She closed the notebook and stared at the ceiling. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice, soft and firm, saying, "Don't wait for permission to shine." Across campus, Carter was battling his own decision. He wanted to show someone the footage, but who? Would they believe him? Would they care? Or would it backfire? He knew Harvard wasn't always kind to people who broke the mold. But what if this changed everything? And in the quiet echo of room 4C, Ruby's chalk still clung to the board. Cold, bold, daring anyone to say she didn't belong. By morning, half the math department would be standing in front of that board, stunned, but Ruby wouldn't know that until someone came knocking. The morning after Ruby Whittaker left her solution boldly scrawled across the chalkboard in room 4C, the air at Harvard was already buzzing, though she had no idea. It started when the first graduate student unlocked the lecture hall. Expecting the usual smudged reminders of the last class, he froze at the sight of what had been left behind. A flawlessly solved equation. One that had stumped even Levington himself. The solution was complete, annotated with side notes and alternative pathways, as if the author had not just solved it, but taught themselves along the way. Within an hour, the news spread through the math department like wildfire. Professors whispered in corridors, undergraduates speculated on Reddit threads, and Carter Bowman, the student tech who had seen the security footage, remained silent, still unsure what to do with the truth he'd stumbled upon. But Ruby was just trying to stay invisible. She was in the admin building that afternoon, dropping off a bucket from a leaky janitor closet. On her cart lay something she hadn't meant to pick up, a Harvard ID name tag that had fallen behind a desk in the faculty lounge earlier that morning. It read Whittaker, her last name. Someone else's first initial. It made her smile for a moment. She hadn't worn a name tag in weeks since hers had ripped clean off in the laundry. Without thinking, she clipped it onto her uniform. As she pushed her cart toward the building's service exit, a sharply dressed administrator intercepted her near the lobby. His suit was expensive. His eyes were judgmental. "You there. You hold on," he said, stepping into her path with a sharpness that made her instinctively pull the cart back. Ruby blinked. "Yes, sir." He glanced at her name tag, then back at her face, his brows knitting together. "Where did you get that ID?" She frowned. "It was on the floor in the lounge. I thought maybe you thought it was okay to impersonate faculty." His voice rose with suspicion. "I wasn't impersonating anyone. My tag ripped off. It was a coincidence." He crossed his arms. "You think it's a coincidence that a custodial worker just happens to find a Harvard name tag with a matching last name and puts it on, while inside an administrative building not listed on your cleaning schedule? I'm just here to drop off a maintenance. You're not authorized to be in this hallway. I need to call campus security." Ruby stiffened. "I haven't done anything wrong. That's not for you to decide." The interaction turned heads. A few students passed by, glancing, then looking away. The administrator continued, lowering his voice, but sharpening his tone. "You are being aggressive now. I asked you a simple question." "I wasn't aggressive. Raising your voice is unnecessary. This is Harvard, not a street corner." The words sliced deeper than he could have imagined. Ruby's chest tightened. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the way he looked at her. Like she didn't belong, like she was trespassing in a world meant for someone else. Moments later, a campus officer approached, summoned by the admin's call. The officer asked for identification, and Ruby provided her janitor's card. She tried to explain the name tag, the errand, the coincidence, but every word made her sound more like a problem, and less like a person. The admin spoke again. "We've had issues with unauthorized access lately. This might be a bigger issue. Let's take her to—" "Wait," came a voice from behind them. Everyone turned. A student, tall, bespectacled, with a stack of textbooks in his arms, had stopped mid-step, his gaze fixed on Ruby, but not her face. He was staring at her cart, and more specifically, at the edge of her notebook that peeked out from beneath a rag. Is that yours?" he asked, pointing. Ruby instinctively pushed the rag over it. The admin spoke sharply. "This is a security matter. Please move along." But the student stepped forward. "No, hold on. I saw this handwriting today, in Levington's lecture hall. It's hers, isn't it?" He turned to Ruby. "You solved that integral. The one left on the board. You wrote it." The admin scoffed. "Impossible. That equation is part of doctoral level research. She's cleaning floors." The student ignored him and took another step closer. His voice dropped, stunned. "That was my thesis topic. And she cracked it. It took me 8 months to get halfway there. And Ruby didn't say anything. Her hands were clenched, but her eyes gave her away. The fear, the fury, the exhaustion of being judged by the color of her skin, the clothes she wore, the badge she didn't own. The campus officer shifted awkwardly, sensing the moment changing. The admin's confidence started to waver. She shouldn't be treated like a criminal. The student said firmly. She's clearly smarter than half this department. Ruby finally spoke, her voice quiet. I didn't mean to cause trouble. You didn't, the student said. You caused a revolution. But even as the tension in the lobby shifted, Ruby knew this wasn't over. She could feel it in the air, the way the administrator's eyes narrowed, the way power didn't like being embarrassed. That night, Ruby received an anonymous email with a subject line that froze her blood. They're watching you now. The email arrived at 1:13 a.m., with no name, no greeting, only a subject line that felt like ice across her spine. They're watching you now. Ruby sat motionless on the edge of her cot, the glow from her phone the only light in the room. Her heart pounded against her ribs, as if trying to break free. The email body was empty. No signature, no instructions. But the message was clear. Someone had seen her. Someone had decided she was a threat. By dawn, the fear had taken root. She arrived on campus early, silent and deliberate, moving her cart like armor through the polished corridors. The whispers were louder now, not from janitorial staff, but from students. Is that her? The girl with the notebook? She's not even a student here. Word had spread, not just about the solution left on the board, but the confrontation in the admin building. People knew her face now, but they didn't know her name. And they didn't know her story. At 10:47 a.m., a message buzzed through the custodial group chat, summoning her to room 4C for a meeting. No further details, just an address and a time. She hesitated, then notebook tucked tightly under her arm. She walked straight into the lion's den. Inside the lecture hall, it wasn't just a meeting, it was a tribunal. Professor Levington stood at the center, arms crossed, flanked by 2 faculty members and 3 graduate students, all seated, silent, waiting. The room was cold, despite the sunshine streaming through the arched windows, cold with calculation, cold with judgment. Miss Whitaker, Levington began without preamble. We've received reports. He didn't ask her to sit. He didn't introduce the others. To him, she was not a person with rights. She was a case to be handled. Reports that you've been leaving markings on our academic boards, he continued, and that you may have entered restricted areas using false credentials. Ruby's fingers tightened around the strap of her notebook. Her voice was steady, but low. I didn't enter any restricted areas. I cleaned those rooms. In the equation? Levington asked, gesturing to a printed photo of the chalkboard. This is your work? A beat passed. Yes. A murmur moved across the table. One of the grad students looked up sharply, his expression shifting from suspicion to fascination. Another professor leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You're saying, Levington said slowly, that you, a janitor, independently solved a graduate-level problem from a course you've never taken? Ruby nodded once. I watch your lectures, through the glass, every night after my shift starts. The room went silent. Even Levington hesitated for a moment. Then he chuckled, a sharp, dry sound that cut the air. Well, that explains the grammar, he said. A few of the others smiled. Ruby didn't. I wasn't trying to be noticed, she said quietly. I was just solving it, because I could. Levington picked up a piece of chalk and tossed it toward the board. Then show us, use your method. Let's see if you actually understand it, or if you just memorized someone else's solution. The challenge wasn't academic. It was personal. It wasn't about the math. It was about humiliation. Ruby stepped forward slowly. She didn't walk like a student used to defending theories. She walked like someone used to being told to stay silent. But her hand didn't tremble when it touched the board. She began to write. This time she didn't just retrace her steps. She explained each move aloud. She broke the equation into digestible concepts, translating complex layers into plain English, without losing the math's integrity. She didn't sound rehearsed. She sounded intuitive. She wasn't just solving. She was teaching. By the time she reached the final line, the room was dead quiet. One of the graduate students leaned in and whispered, "That's a new approach. I've never seen that path used before." The professor next to him nodded slowly. "It's more efficient than the one we use, But Levington didn't move. He just stared, expression unreadable. Then he stepped toward her.
"Well, Ms. Whitaker," he said with a slow, poisonous smile,
"You've certainly shown a talent for mimicry. I suppose cleaning up after geniuses eventually leaves a little residue." Ruby's eyes didn't blink.
"You know," he added, "you really should consider how you speak in these situations. That grammar of yours might be acceptable in the break room, but in academia we have standards."
He turned back to the table. "This isn't a think tank. This is Harvard. You don't get to waltz in with a mop and declare yourself a mathematician." Ruby felt her throat tighten. She thought of her grandmother, her mother's second job, her own nights on this campus, sweeping the remnants of the minds they revered. Something broke inside her, not with rage, but with resolve. "I never declared anything," she said softly. "You did that when you decided I wasn't worth listening to." Levington scoffed. "Stick to scrubbing, Miss Whitaker. It's where you belong." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't cry. Not yet. She turned, walked slowly toward the door. As it closed behind her, the tears finally came, silent, sharp, unwelcome. But so did something else, a fire she'd never felt before, the kind of fire that didn't ask for permission. She pulled out her notebook and flipped to a blank page. At the top she wrote one sentence: "They don't get to decide who I am." That night, she began writing a new equation, one the department hadn't even released yet, because Ruby had hacked into the internal academic server and found something she was never meant to see. The tears had barely dried from her face when Ruby stood in the elevator alone, rising past the classrooms and staff floors into the archives level, a place she technically had no clearance to access. But clearance at Harvard was a fragile thing. A janitor's uniform made her invisible enough to slip through doors no one else questioned. And Ruby had learned the art of invisibility so well, she could wear it like a second skin. After the confrontation in the lecture hall, something inside her had shifted. The humiliation should have broken her. Instead, it awakened a defiance deeper than pride, a hunger to know everything these walls tried to hide. If they wouldn't recognize her from the front of the classroom, she'd climb through the back. So she did. Every night after her shift, long after the lights dimmed and the marble halls emptied, Ruby returned not to mop floors but to haunt the archives. Her access key, meant for utility closets, surprisingly opened the records wing when timed with the changeover in late-night security patrols. It was a trick she'd picked up during the first snowstorm her first winter, when she'd been forced to take shelter indoors and stumbled into the warm, dusty heart of Harvard's most forgotten vaults. The room was a fortress of silence. Bound journals stacked wall to wall, microfilm reels from before her mother's birth, dissertations that had shaped policy and science, yet had been buried here, untouched. At first she came only for math. She devoured archive journals on topology, quantum mechanics, statistical geometry, articles from the 1950s with marginal notes from professors long dead, forgotten equations that failed then, but suddenly sparked new answers in her mind. Her notebook thickened, her margins tighter. Ruby's brain wasn't just retaining the information, it was reorganizing it, compressing layers of knowledge into intuitive insights. Within weeks, her abilities surged beyond comprehension. Her fingers moved before she even understood what they were writing. It wasn't mimicry, it was creation. The kind of creation tenured professors built careers around. Still, every day she wore the same gray uniform, cleaned the same glass doors, pushed the same mop, passed the same feet, that never slowed to acknowledge her. The deeper she went into the archives, the clearer the hypocrisy became. She found one thesis from 1971, a rudimentary attempt at a geometric coding system that was praised at the time. Ruby saw the flaw in seconds. She scribbled in the margins, showing how a matrix inversion shortcut would have tripled its efficiency, then paused, realizing what she was doing. She was annotating history, and no one would ever read it. No one except her. Until the night she stumbled upon folder 19. It was wedged between an unmarked envelope of student files and a collection of failed grant proposals. The folder was thick, yellowing, and tied with a single black thread. A small tag on the corner read, "Private Review, Dean's Committee Only." She shouldn't have opened it. But Ruby had learned not to wait for permission. Inside were scanned reports of academic anomalies, unexplained submissions, unregistered research papers, untraceable genius-level math patterns found in unauthorized areas. There were half a dozen references to Room 4. Several pages showed photos of chalkboards after hours. One had a blurred silhouette of her. She froze. Someone had been tracking her work. but not to reward it. The reports weren't curious, they were suspicious. Her solutions were categorized as potential internal breach, possible AI interference, and unauthorized intellect. The language chilled her. These weren't academic terms, they were surveillance terms. Near the bottom, a final memo caught her eye. It was dated just 2 weeks ago. Begin committee review of subject. W. Concerns of misattributed genius. Identity unknown. Investigate background, origin, and external influence. Subject W. May not be operating alone. Subject W. Whitaker. They had given her brilliance a code name and treated it like a threat. She shoved the folder back and fled the archives before the cameras could catch her face. That night, she couldn't sleep. The phrase misattributed genius looped in her head like static. They didn't think a black woman in janitor's overalls could possibly be the author, so they assumed she wasn't. Her mind wasn't just doubted, it was denied. Still, Ruby returned the next night, and the one after. Only now she wasn't just learning for herself, she was collecting proof. She began photographing pages, mapping equations, cross-referencing published work with what she had already written years ago in her notebook. She started to notice a pattern. Some of the math she'd casually scribbled on empty boards had resurfaced in student journals, under other people's names. One night, she found a dissertation submitted by a PhD candidate last semester, built almost entirely around a proof she'd left behind in late May. It had been reshaped, polished, cited with other sources, but at its heart, it was hers. Ruby's chest tightened. She wasn't just being watched, she was being stolen from. Yet no one had ever come to ask if the work was hers. They simply assumed it couldn't be, and so they made it theirs. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have anticipated, was that Ruby had been documenting everything, every solution, every board, every notebook page. She wasn't just solving equations anymore. She was building evidence. Proof that brilliance didn't come in blazers or badges. That intellect had no skin color, no salary, no assigned desk. Still, she lived paycheck to paycheck. Still, she pushed her cart down the hallway outside lecture halls that debated ideas she'd already cracked. And every night she smiled quietly at the irony. Until one evening, when she returned to her locker and found a typed letter sealed in a red envelope, her name on the front in bold serif. Ms. Ruby Whitaker, you are hereby invited to a confidential meeting with the Committee for Advanced Theoretical Research. Topic: Anomalous mathematical work in unauthorized areas. Time Thursday, 6 Eurozone p.m.
Location undisclosed. The committee hadn't just noticed her brilliance. They believed she wasn't real. And now they wanted to meet the ghost they thought was haunting Harvard. The red envelope trembled in Ruby's hands.
She had read the letter a dozen times since retrieving it from her locker, each word sinking deeper than the last. An invitation from Harvard's Committee for Advanced Theoretical Research. The very inner circle she had once fantasized about observing from the back row, now summoning her like a ghost. They weren't sure existed. She didn't know whether it was a trap, a test, or an ambush. But she did know one thing. Someone had finally said her name. And that alone changed the rules. She never got to attend that meeting, because the story leaked first. A student worker, the same Carter Bowman who had seen her on the camera weeks earlier, finally gave in to impulse and anonymously uploaded a clip to a private Discord. The footage of a black janitor solving Livington's lecture problem, complete with audio of her breathing heavily as she reached the solution's final line. It was meant to inspire his small online study group. It broke the internet. By morning, the video had been clipped, subtitled, and viewed over 4 million times across TikTok, Reddit, and Twitter. The caption that made it go viral: Harvard janitor solves grad-level math, like it's a crossword. Some praised her as a hidden genius. Others called it a rags-to-riches moment in the making. Hashtags like "Done Ruby the real genius" and "Gen Math Made" trended. But admiration quickly curdled into scrutiny. The very next day, the backlash began. Conservative pundits and academic gatekeepers tore into the story. They claimed it was manufactured inspiration, accusing Harvard of staging a stunt for optics. Others questioned the authenticity of the footage. Reddit threads dissected her posture, her method, her appearance. "No way she's legit," one post read. "She probably just memorized it from a textbook. They're trying to make her some kind of diversity symbol." An op-ed in a major academic publication declared, "A janitor solving elite math doesn't signal hope. It signals academic inflation." Then came the most cutting headline of all. Janitor or fraud? The truth behind the viral math myth. Ruby read the article in a bathroom stall, knees pressed to her chest, phone clenched in her hand. Her name wasn't mentioned. They hadn't even bothered to verify it. But the implication was loud. She was too black, too poor, too uncredentialed to be that intelligent. Her inbox flooded. Some emails offered podcast interviews or scholarships. Others contained thinly veiled threats. You didn't earn this attention. You hijacked it. The worst came from inside Harvard. A letter from the committee that had once invited her suddenly changed its tone. The new message was clinical, curt. Due to recent media exposure, the committee is placing all investigations on hold. We will not be moving forward with any formal acknowledgement or meeting at this time. No apology, no clarification, just distance. As if her visibility had become their liability. She walked through campus the next day in a fog, pushing her cart while students paused mid-sentence to stare. One whispered, "That's the girl," while another muttered, "She probably Googled the answer." No one cared about the sleepless nights, the archives, the stolen work. What they cared about was preserving the illusion that brilliance only belonged to those with badges, lab coats, and trust funds. Ruby went home that night and locked herself in the bathroom, notebook in hand. Her mind, once fluid and fearless, now hesitated at every line. Every number on the page reminded her of a ceiling she couldn't break, not because she lacked the math, but because she lacked the permission. And yet, she kept writing. She couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything. That's when the letter came. Not another envelope in her locker. Not a Harvard seal. It was dropped through her mail slot, hand-delivered, marked in gold lettering. Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Department of Mathematics. She opened it slowly, expecting another PR inquiry or denial. But inside was something else entirely.
Ms. Whitaker.
We've reviewed your viral footage. But more importantly, we've reviewed the archived board work from Room 4C, which we've tracked over the last 10 months. That body of work reflects rare mathematical intuition, creativity, and fluency beyond our current graduate cohort benchmarks. You are not unqualified. You are exactly who we seek. We'd like to offer you a place in our doctoral program, fully funded with immediate access to research, mentorship, and intellectual freedom. There was no catch, no mention of credentials, no SET score demand, no special case phrasing, just math and respect. Ruby sat on the floor for nearly an hour, the letter in her lap. She didn't cry, not yet. Instead, she whispered into the silence. So now they believe me. But only because someone else said I was real. The irony wasn't lost on her.
It hadn't taken Levington's approval.
It had taken going viral. Her value hadn't changed, only her visibility had. Still, the offer from MIT meant something deeper. It wasn't charity. It wasn't damage control. It was an invitation to belong, not in the hallways outside the classrooms, but inside them, at the table. And this time she wouldn't enter quietly. But before she could respond, her phone vibrated. A new notification, an anonymous tip, a screenshot, an internal Harvard message board post, visible only to faculty. We must ensure MIT's offer doesn't make us look complicit. Begin campaign to discredit the solution's originality. Frame as AI-assisted work. Ruby closed the message slowly, because her next move wouldn't be submission. It would be exposure. The MIT letter stayed on Ruby's kitchen table for 3 full days. She didn't frame it. She didn't post it online. She didn't even tell her mother, not yet. Some victories weren't meant to be celebrated immediately. Some were too heavy, too fragile. She read it again each morning before her shift, as if making sure it hadn't evaporated overnight. But by the 4th day, the silence from Harvard was replaced by something colder. Strategic noise. First came the subtle rewrites in campus memory. Levington, who hadn't so much as credited her work in the lecture hall, now told a faculty colleague that she'd been mentored quietly, perhaps overstepping boundaries, but still a bright autodidact. Then came the department's internal memo. We encourage faculty to maintain professional discretion during ongoing public scrutiny. Do not confirm unverified claims regarding unauthorized personnel producing original academic material. Ruby read that line 3 times. Unauthorized personnel, producing, original, as if she were a malfunction, not a mathematician. But the real shift came 2 weeks after the MIT offer, when Harvard's name was notably absent from every article now hailing Ruby as a genius. That silence wasn't indifference. It was calculation. Harvard couldn't erase her. She was now too public, too praised, too visible, but they could cast doubt. They could protect their brand by eroding her credibility, grain by grain. A new op-ed appeared in a respected academic review. The title? Romanticizing Raw Genius. When viral stories overwrite real research. It didn't maim her, but it quoted a source close to the math department, who claimed that her work showed strong signs of AI-generated structuring and lacked citation awareness. Another sentence questioned whether reverse engineering from published work might explain the suspicious fluency of her solution. The twist stung. They weren't denying she had talent. They were saying it wasn't hers, that she must have stolen it. Or worse, fabricated it using tools she couldn't even afford. Ruby knew what this was. A smear campaign disguised in academic rhetoric. She also knew she was facing something far more insidious than a bad headline. She was facing Harvard's fear, not of her intellect, but of her origin story. Because if she was real, then every gate they'd guarded with legacy admissions and test scores could be questioned. If someone like her could appear out of nowhere, the entire myth of meritocracy crumbled. So they fought. Quietly. Surgically. Emails Ruby sent to request copies of archived chalkboard images from previous semesters went unanswered. Professors she'd once overheard admiring her board work refused to speak to the media. One even tweeted, "Brilliance requires discipline and training, not just TikTok validation." Ruby didn't respond. Instead, she wrote. In her notebook, on her walls, across blank whiteboards, she borrowed from night classrooms. Not for revenge, for truth, for clarity, for armor. Carter Bowman, the student tech who first leaked her footage, reached out anonymously with an offer. "There's more," he wrote in a private message. "Stuff I found in archived server logs. Want it?" Ruby said yes. What he sent changed everything. Old faculty Zoom recordings, internal Slack messages, metadata logs. Most of it was bureaucratic noise, but buried within one mislabeled folder was a single video file. Low resolution, poor audio, time-stamped a week before Ruby had ever left her first chalkboard equation behind. The clip opened with Professor Levington on a department call. Unaware the recording had been saved. Someone had asked about rumors of strange board work showing up after hours. Levington laughed. "Probably a janitor playing Einstein," he said. "We'll paint over it. Can't have the donors thinking we're letting help scribble proofs." Then silence. "Then, let's just say the floors are cleaner than the math." Ruby paused the video. She didn't cry. Not anymore. This wasn't new. This was confirmation. Confirmation of what had always been whispered behind sealed doors. The racism was never overt, never shouted. It was subtle, professional, polished, academic. The same way Levington corrected her grammar in public. The same way admissions called her non-traditional. The same way faculty tweets framed her as viral noise. She took the video to MIT's contact, a professor named Dr. Elise Hardin, who had helped push her acceptance through. Elise watched it once, then said only 3 words. "We'll handle this." That afternoon, the video leaked. Not from Ruby. From MIT. They posted a 30-second excerpt with the caption, "This is what some institutions think genius looks like." The fallout was immediate. Hashtags trended again, but this time with a sharper tone. Sharpered humiliation. Racist by design. Ruby deserved better. News anchors replayed Levington's smirk on a loop. Harvard released a non-apology filled with phrases like miscommunication, taken out of context, and ongoing review. But the court of public opinion was no longer on their side. Ruby's inbox exploded again. But this time the messages weren't mixed. They were furious, empowering, demanding justice. And still in the storm's eye, Ruby stood quiet. Not because she was broken. Because she was ready. The next day she put on the only dress shirt she owned, buttoned it to the collar, and walked into MIT's campus for the first time, not as a visitor, not as a viral story, but as a doctoral candidate. She was greeted at the door by Dr. Hardin, who simply said, "Welcome home." For the first time in her life, Ruby felt like she wasn't trespassing. Still, part of her remained restless, because somewhere inside those Harvard walls, she knew something had been buried deeper than the racism. She hadn't yet uncovered who had stolen her earlier equations. She hadn't yet revealed what the committee had really done with her chalkboard work, months before the world ever knew her name. That night, a former grad student messaged her with one line, "Check page 37 of the Journal of Pure Math Fall Edition." Because Ruby's work had already been published, under someone else's name. Ruby Whittaker sat in silence at a corner table inside MIT's math library, the page in front of her trembling slightly under her fingers. The journal was thin, bound in institutional blue, its title stamped in gold foil, Journal of Pure Mathematics Fall Edition. On page 37, her worst fear unfolded. A full spread, titled An Alternative Path Through Nonlinear Tensor Fields, credited to Dr. Jared Klein, Harvard Department of Mathematics. It was her equation. Not just inspired by, not loosely based on. It was the very same chalkboard sequence she had once left behind after a shift in room 4C. Every variable, every annotation, even the subtle correction she'd made in the margin. It was hers, word for word, line for line. Only now it had a white man's name printed across the top. Klein had stolen it. Not copied, published. Her breath caught in her throat as the memory of her own handwriting, scribbled under flickering hallway lights, rushed back. No one had been around. She hadn't taken a picture. She had been careful. But somehow, Klein had gotten it. The camera footage, the janitorial trash, the committee's surveillance, she didn't know how. But she knew why. He'd seen an opportunity. A silent, unprotected black woman, solving elite math problems in a world where she was never meant to be seen. And he took what she made, scrubbed the fingerprints off, and called it his own. This time, the tears came not from humiliation, but from fury. Not loud, shaking fury. Cold fury. The kind that doesn't burn. It freezes. It clarifies. The media had already erupted after the leaked Levington video, and now this journal article was proof that Harvard's problem wasn't just one arrogant professor. It was systemic. It wasn't about a single insult or headline. It was about theft, silence, erasure. And Ruby wasn't the first. As news of Levington's recorded remarks spread, other voices began speaking up. Quiet ones, familiar ones, janitors, cafeteria workers, security guards, mostly black, mostly ignored. They came forward with stories, not about math but about being passed over, mocked, excluded from basic dignity. One custodial worker from Princeton revealed that his son's scholarship application had been flagged for audit after staff saw his last name matched a campus janitor. A black secretary from Yale shared how her lunchroom conversations about legal theory were once reported to HR as suspicious behavior. And now Ruby, a young woman who had solved graduate-level problems with no access, no degree, no mentor, was no longer just a headline. She was a mirror, and the reflection terrified them. Overnight, campus protests erupted across the Ivy League. Students carried signs that read, "Genius doesn't wear a badge," and "Who else did you erase?" Hashtags like "Stolen Genius" and "Black Brains Matter" trended globally. Yet Ruby stayed silent. She turned down every interview request, every podcast, every news anchor begging for her side of the story. She didn't want a spectacle. She wanted change. And she knew from history that change never came when black women cried on cue for public sympathy. It came from strategy. Behind the scenes, she worked with Dr. Hardin and two legal scholars at MIT to build a formal challenge against the Journal of Pure Mathematics, not just to retract the paper, but to publicly acknowledge plagiarism and investigate how her solution had been accessed in the first place. It wasn't just about credit, it was about truth. Her refusal to give sound bites only amplified public speculation. The media called her mysterious. Some outlets suggested she was preparing a lawsuit. One viral thread theorized that she was building her own research lab to recruit non-traditional prodigies. All of it missed the mark. Because Ruby's plan was simpler and far more dangerous to the system. She wanted the system to confess. At the same time, an anonymous document began circulating online. It listed known instances of suspected intellectual theft from black and brown students and staff across 5 Ivy League campuses, including publication dates, project titles, and the original author's erased name. Some were urban legends, whispered in dorms. Others were provable. Many traced back to advisory committees, recommendation bottlenecks, or faculty who had mentored students only to later publish similar work independently. No one confirmed it publicly, but everyone knew the list was real. It was called the Ledger. Ruby didn't create it, but the timing? That was no coincidence. One evening, she stood alone at the edge of MIT's empty lecture hall, staring out the window toward Harvard's distant skyline. Her voice was barely a whisper. "They erased me once," she said. "They won't do it again." Back in Harvard's administration wing, chaos brewed. Emails leaked showing that senior officials had known about Klein's plagiarism weeks before Ruby did, and had attempted to suppress investigation under the guise of protecting institutional integrity. The scandal was no longer just about race or class. It was about credibility. What did it mean if one of the world's most prestigious academic bodies knowingly protected plagiarism to silence a black woman genius? It meant the ivory tower wasn't cracked. It was hollow. Levington resigned first. His exit statement blamed cancel culture, claiming his remarks were taken out of context. Klein followed days later, avoiding press entirely. Rumors swirled that he had taken a private consulting job at a hedge fund. But Harvard still refused to acknowledge Ruby by name. They called the events unfortunate misunderstandings. They called her the subject of attention. They never called her what she was, the rightful author. Yet Ruby never raised her voice, because she didn't need to. The louder the institution stumbled to control the narrative, the more the world leaned in to listen to the silence behind it. And Ruby, she kept writing. Quietly, fiercely, and not alone. Students began reaching out, young, gifted minds who had dropped out, been rejected, or simply never applied because they assumed brilliance had a zip code. They wanted mentorship. They wanted space. They wanted to belong. And Ruby was already building something for them. But she wasn't doing it from a place of rage. She was doing it from justice. Real justice. Not courtrooms. Not headlines. Restorative justice. The kind that built something after everything else had burned down. One evening, Ruby stood before an empty chalkboard and wrote a single line. They stole my equations. I'm giving the next generation the keys. Because she wasn't done exposing the truth. She was just getting started. Ruby Whittaker entered her first seminar at MIT not with trembling nerves or imposter syndrome, but with measured stillness. She wore a simple sweater and jeans. No makeup, no pretense. The room held 12 students, all handpicked by Dr. Lise Hardin, each one either a doctoral candidate or visiting scholar. Ruby was the only one without a transcript or a GRE score. But when she picked up the marker, the room listened, because her mind didn't follow formulas. It bent. In the first week, she solved an open-ended problem on spatial probability that had stumped half the cohort. In the second, she corrected a misstep in a visiting professor's proposed method respectfully, succinctly, and flawlessly. By the third week, students stopped asking who let her in and started asking how does she think like that. The answer was always the same. She never learned their way, so she never learned their limits. But what shocked them most wasn't just her speed or originality. It was her ability to teach concepts with metaphors that made abstract theory feel tactile. She once described complex multivariable integration as braiding rivers through time. Another time she likened topological surfaces to wrinkled skin waiting for memory. These weren't tricks, they were revelations. And yet, with every lecture that ended in stunned applause, another email or whisper would circle back to her through Elise. She doesn't belong in peer review. She hasn't paid her dues. She skipped the system. That's dangerous. They weren't math critiques. They were warnings. Because while MIT welcomed her, Harvard hadn't let go. Behind closed doors, Harvard's board of governance was fractured. Some trustees, mostly those from newer generations, wanted to issue a public apology, acknowledge Klein's theft, and extend Ruby a formal invitation to lecture. But others, older and more invested in protecting the institution's legacy, resisted. If we validate her, one board member allegedly said, we set a precedent we can't control. What happens when the next janitor starts scribbling on our chalkboards? Another warned, she's not a professor, she's a populist, she's dangerous. The internal debate wasn't about math, it was about power. And in the shadows of that power struggle, another player entered the game. Someone Ruby didn't know existed, until she received the email. It arrived late on a Thursday evening, titled simply From Someone Who Knows. The message came from a burner account. No name, no attachments, just a single Dropbox link, and a sentence. If you still care about the truth, read this before they erase it. Ruby's cursor hovered for several seconds before she clicked. What downloaded was a compressed folder of documents, internal memos, draft articles, and most damning of all, a spreadsheet labeled Equation Attribution Matrix, Departmental Internal Use. She opened it. Every row told a story of intellectual theft. Equations Ruby had written on chalkboards in silence were tracked by time, date, and shockingly, cross-referenced with names of students and faculty who had later used similar work in published journals and grant applications. Some cells were color-coded. Red meant unpublished and flagged. Yellow meant currently under review. Green meant successfully published. Ruby's name appeared in the notes column more than a dozen times, but not as an author, as a suspected contributor, a ghost. She leaned back. The air sucked from her lungs. They hadn't just stolen her work. They had systematized it. There was a process, a system for scrubbing origin, rebranding her intellect through wider, wealthier mouths, and it had been running longer than she had ever imagined. One document in the folder revealed a full conversation between department chairs debating whether to claim the brilliance retroactively by offering her a silent honorary certificate without enrollment. They wanted to rewrite her past to justify their own theft.
That was the moment Ruby knew.
This wasn't a war for reputation. It was a war for reality. She called Elise that night, voice cold. "They've been doing this to more than just me." "I know," Elise said softly. "We just didn't have proof. We do now." The next morning, Ruby contacted the Open Science Consortium, an independent watchdog group for academic transparency. She gave them everything: the spreadsheet, the memos, the timeline. She didn't demand credit. She demanded exposure. At the same time, Elise pulled strings to get the consortium access to internal faculty citations across Ivy League journals, a move that sent panic rippling through old institutions. Within days, the consortium published a report titled Mathematics, Marginalization, and Manipulation, a data-driven case study on institutional erasure. It wasn't just about Ruby. It was about the system she exposed. Headlines exploded again, but this time with numbers, patterns, undeniable receipts. The media called it the ghost genius scandal. Harvard tried to downplay its role, but one slip from an assistant professor caught on a hot mic saying, "She never would have gotten this far if she'd stayed quiet," sent their PR team scrambling. Ruby, meanwhile, kept working. She had started building her own initiative, quietly housed inside MIT, a program for gifted students of color from underserved communities, designed not just to tutor them, but to trust them. She called it the Unseen Lab. Her first cohort, 4 high school dropouts, 2 formerly incarcerated young men, and a girl who had never once taken an official math class but spoke in equations like a second language. It was unconventional. It was brilliant. It was hers. But even in that moment of creation, a whisper of the past came back to her. An email from the same anonymous account. This time, with a name, Jordan Chen, Harvard doctoral student. Data science. He wrote, "I copied your solution once. I justified it to myself. Said it was anonymous. But I watched what they did after. How they edited your footnotes. How they filtered your tone. And how they laughed about scrubbing you out. I couldn't take it anymore." He ended with a warning. "They're going to offer you something soon. Maybe a title. Maybe a belated acknowledgement. But it won't be for you. It'll be to save them. Don't let them buy your silence." Ruby didn't reply. Instead, she opened a blank document and wrote the title of her next paper. Proof of Existence. When Math is the Only Thing That Believed in Me. Because now she didn't just have proof of her genius. She had proof of theirs, and how far they'd gone to bury her. The wind outside MIT's mathematics wing howled against the glass, but inside the archive lab, the air was still charged with the weight of something undeniable. Ruby sat across from Elise and 2 members of the Open Science Consortium, the laptop screen between them illuminating the spreadsheet that had cracked the facade of academic integrity. Each line, each time-stamped equation, wasn't just data. It was evidence. Ruby's equations, raw, original, annotated in the margins, with her shorthand annotations, and even little doodles she used to decode complex integrations, were scattered across multiple faculty publications at Harvard. Some were lightly modified, others were copied almost identically. The most damning of all was a pattern. Equations she had written months ago, left behind on chalkboards, turned into journal submissions just weeks later under different names. At least 6 professors had reused her work. 3 students had used it in these. And Harvard's Department of Academic Records had logged it, reviewed it, and approved it. There were internal approvals marked with faculty signatures. Signatures that predated the submission dates. Ruby leaned back, staring at the ceiling, her voice flat. "They've been laundering my ideas." Elise swallowed, and Harvard signed off every step of the way. The room sat in heavy silence. The consortium's director, a quiet man named Alton Monroe, leaned forward. "This isn't just plagiarism. This is academic fraud at the institutional level. They didn't just steal your work, they industrialized it. One of the emails in the data dump came from the assistant dean's office. It read, "We must move swiftly to integrate the recent board contributions from secondary sources. Ensure authorship appears credentialed. Prior incidents taught us that optics matter." Ruby's face didn't flinch. She'd read that line a dozen times already. "Secondary sources," she whispered. "That's what they called me. A machine, a ghost, an uncredited cog that made their work shine." Elise looked at her, hesitant. "If you want to file a suit, we have a legal team ready." But Ruby shook her head. "No," she said. "A lawsuit makes this about me. This isn't just about me anymore." "What then?" Alton asked. "I want the truth to be louder than their silence." That night, Ruby drafted an email. Subject line requesting use of MIT's auditorium for public statement. She didn't call it a press conference at first. But the moment word got out that Ruby Whittaker, the woman Harvard called a myth, a janitor, a fluke, was making a public address, the media frenzy ignited instantly. Every major outlet RSVP'd. CNN, PBS, NPR, even international networks from Germany, South Africa, Brazil. By the time the day arrived, the lecture hall was over capacity. An overflow crowd gathered on the steps outside, watching on giant screens. Dozens of students held signs that read, "Stolen math is stolen futures." Ruby's mind, Harvard's shame. Cite black women. Ruby walked onto the stage without a script. She wore her old janitor's uniform, cleaned, pressed, and ironed to perfection. The moment she stood behind the podium, the room fell silent. "I didn't come here to prove anything," she began. "Because I already did. The chalkboards proved it. The equations proved it. The fear they had of me proved it." She held up a page from the Harvard Journal, where her solution was published under someone else's name. "They said I wasn't qualified, that my grammar wasn't refined, that I didn't have the credentials." Her voice didn't shake. It sharpened. "But what I did have was brilliance. What I had was vision. And what I had and still have is a memory sharper than the lies they printed." She walked the audience through the theft, how equations she left behind while cleaning had been absorbed, repackaged, and redistributed under names that matched the mold academia was comfortable promoting. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a pattern, a policy, a practice. Gasps echoed as she displayed portions of the leaked spreadsheet. "This is what erasure looks like," she said. "Dignified, peer-reviewed, bound in gold foil." And then she paused. "I was never supposed to be seen. Not as a scholar, not as a thinker, just as a shadow in the hallway." The silence cracked as camera shutters clicked. Tears rolled down student faces, and the world watched. Not just a woman reclaiming her name, but indicting a machine built to forget her. Elise stood in the back, her chest tight with something between rage and pride. And then, just as Ruby looked ready to finish, she surprised everyone. "I'm not here to burn Harvard down," she said. "That's too easy." The audience blinked, confused. "I'm here to build something bigger, something they'll never understand, because they don't know what it's like to learn in the dark." The room held its breath. And then she said it. "I'm launching a new public database, the Ledger Project. Anyone who's ever had their work stolen, their name erased, their brilliance doubted, submit it. We'll record it, we'll verify it, and we'll cite it properly, permanently, publicly." Cheers erupted. But Ruby wasn't done. She looked straight into the cameras. "To every institution that's ever claimed to value diversity while silencing it, this is your warning. You don't get to decide who history remembers anymore." She stepped back from the podium. The crowd rose to its feet. And as the applause shook the walls, Ruby stepped off the stage, her janitor's uniform now a symbol of resistance, intellect, and unrepentant clarity. As she exited, Elise caught up to her and handed her a flash drive. This came anonymously. "It's from inside Harvard's legal office." Ruby plugged it in backstage. The first file opened with one chilling subject line: "Settlement strategy. Silence Whittaker without admission of guilt." The day Ruby Whittaker stepped onto the national stage, America held its breath. The auditorium at MIT had barely cooled from her press conference days earlier, and yet here she was again, this time under hotter lights, broader reach, and higher stakes. A primetime interview, live on PBS, simulcast across major streaming platforms. Not a soundbite, not a viral clip, a full hour, uncut, raw. The producers offered makeup, wardrobe, media coaching. Ruby declined all three. She wore the same gray jacket she'd worn when she cleaned chalkboards. Patched, simple, honest. She didn't want polish. She wanted the country to see the truth as it had always looked. Quiet, determined, invisible, until forced into view. Across the nation, living rooms buzzed with anticipation. Classrooms projected the feed. Journalists primed their pens. Critics braced for gaffes. And Ruby exhaled. The interview began softly. The host, a well-respected black journalist named Carla Mays, opened with empathy. When did you first realize they weren't going to give you credit? Ruby smiled, the kind that hides a history too long to summarize. The first time I solved something and erased it before they could see it, she said, because I already knew what they'd say, that I got lucky, that I copied, that someone must have helped me. Carla nodded. So why keep solving? Ruby's eyes lifted. Because the math didn't lie. People did. That was the first ripple. Then came the storm. She shared how she cleaned floors while memorizing equations, others discarded like trash. How she decoded entire journals at night using outdated library access and taught herself notation systems from overheard lectures. She recounted how her notes were tossed, her presence questioned, her silence exploited. But it was when she described that first chalkboard, the one she had filled, solved, then erased with trembling hands, that the nation stopped blinking. I was never afraid of being wrong, she said. I was afraid of being right, and still not being believed. Her voice cracked, not from weakness but from something deeper, the ache of long-term dismissal. I solved something that took others months, and they laughed at my grammar. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Carla asked the questions carefully. Ruby answered without rehearsal. Her vocabulary was elegant without pretension. She quoted no philosophers. She made no sweeping claims. And yet, every word landed like a revelation. They thought the absence of a degree meant the absence of discipline, she said. But I worked 10 hours a day, then studied 6 more. I built a curriculum out of forgotten chalk and broken projectors. She paused. You don't need a classroom to learn, but sometimes you need a classroom to be seen. By the midpoint of the interview, social media exploded. Clips circulated in real time. I was solving Ivy League problems with mop water on my shoes. They weren't scared. I was wrong. They were scared I was right, without permission. Hashtags returned. And Ruby taught us. Whitaker wisdom. Unfiltered genius. Carla asked one final question. If you could speak to the people who doubted you most, the ones who ignored, mocked, erased, what would you say? Ruby didn't pause. I'd say thank you, she replied, because if they had accepted me too soon, I would have joined their system. Instead, I had to build something better. The audience on set gave her a standing ovation. But the most unexpected reaction came moments after the broadcast ended. Back at Harvard, in a quiet office lined with antique books and old citations, Professor Thomas Levington, the same man who once told Ruby to stick to scrubbing, sat watching the live stream alone. His face, once stern with entitlement, now drooped in a mix of regret and resentment. He turned off the TV. Then, without fanfare, he opened a blank email draft. Subject: resignation. Effective immediately.
He didn't write a message, just signed his name.
But before clicking send, he opened one last browser window and did something no one expected. He uploaded a private video file, one he had stored encrypted, hidden for months. A recording from Room 4C's security system, the original untouched footage of Ruby solving the unsolved equation, weeks before the world ever knew her name. He released it to the public, with this single caption: I didn't believe her, but she didn't need my belief to be brilliant. She always was. It was the closest thing to a confession Harvard would ever get. But the twist didn't end there. Within hours, Ruby received a message from a student she didn't know. A quiet, unremarkable freshman who had been part of a hidden mailing list Levington had curated for years. Scholars of structure. The student attached a PDF. An internal lecture Levington had given to this small circle titled The Threat of Unorthodox Minds. Inside, he laid out a strategy for maintaining epistemic order at Harvard. He called it guided containment. He had been training students not just to excel, but to identify and suppress thinkers like Ruby before they could disrupt the hierarchy. It wasn't just a prejudice. It had been a philosophy. Ruby stared at the document for a long time. Guided containment, she whispered. They had a system for burying us. She looked up at Elise and said, It's time to build a system that protects us. Because the war wasn't just over her mind, it was over every mind they'd ever tried to hide. Ruby Whittaker had spent her life proving equations. But now, the world was proving her. Weeks after her televised interview rippled across continents, and Levington's internal documents were exposed, Harvard was no longer in damage control. It was in academic freefall. Their carefully guarded myth of meritocracy had been punctured, not by an attack, but by a revelation. The very structure they upheld, of gatekeeping intellect through credentials and polished resumes, had cracked beneath the weight of a janitor's raw, undeniable brilliance. But institutions don't die quietly. And the pushback came hard. A group of high-profile Harvard alumni, most of them tenured, 10-figure, and deeply threatened, began circulating a confidential position paper titled Maintaining Integrity and Academic Standards Post-Whittaker. It never named her directly, but it called for stricter validation of unconventional contributors, better safeguards against social media-driven disruptions to scholarship, and, most glaringly, a formal recommendation to disqualify work that originates outside of credentialed pathways, unless peer-reviewed through traditional structures. In plain English, if you didn't come through the front door, you didn't deserve to be published. The goal was clear: strip Ruby of legitimacy. Reframe her as a fluke. A well-packaged accident. But this time, they were too late. Because something had shifted, not just online but in the ivory towers themselves. In Germany, a team of cryptographers publicly cited Ruby's integration shortcuts as the key to improving their encryption algorithms. In South Korea, a physics journal published a glowing review of her tensor extrapolation model, calling it an elegant rejection of orthodoxy. In Ghana, an entire symposium was held under the banner, Whittaker Structures: The Future of Accessible Abstract Logic. Even Ivy League scholars began breaking ranks. Dr. Mei Lang, from Columbia, wrote an op-ed titled, What Ruby Whittaker Reminded Us About Brilliance. In it, she said, the system didn't miss her. It saw her, and tried to erase her. Another, Dr. David Rosenthal of Princeton, tweeted, If your institution fears intellect that comes without pedigree, it doesn't fear fraud. It fears disruption. Validation poured in. From Nobel laureates. From doctoral students. From professors who used to guard the gates. Now opening them wide. Ruby watched it unfold with cautious distance. She had no desire to become a celebrity. She still refused interviews, unless they focused on her work. Still declined any segment that centered her background over her mind. But she also knew better than to assume safety. One late evening, as she walked through MIT's East Lab after hours, Elise met her with a laptop and a strained expression. They're trying again, she said. A private firm with ties to 3 Harvard trustees submitted a paper undermining your derivations, tried to claim algorithmic origin. Basically that no human could have produced it alone. Ruby blinked. So now I'm not real, and I'm not human. Elise didn't laugh. They want to strip authorship entirely. Attribute it to machine generation. It's their last angle. Ruby sat down, her voice calm. Let them try. The world's already seen the footage. They've heard me walk through the logic. I'm not a ghost anymore. And she was right. The moment the anonymous challenge was posted, an international flood of rebuttals emerged. Mathematicians, programmers, and ethicists across platforms dissected the claim line by line, proving through both logic and pattern analysis that the work was not machine-like, but uniquely human, uniquely Ruby. The accusation didn't just fall flat. It boomeranged. One open letter, signed by over 800 academics from 40 countries, read, We stand with Ruby Whittaker, not just because she is right, but because she has shown us what our institutions forgot, that genius is not gated. It is grown, and it grows in places you refuse to look. The backlash against the firm was immediate. They issued a formal retraction within 72 hours. It was the final, desperate shot, and it backfired. From that point on, Ruby's name was no longer followed by controversy. It was followed by credibility. Her archived notes were being compiled into a formal publication, Equations from the Margins. Her teaching metaphors were adopted into several Ivy League classrooms, with professors citing her style as paradigm-shifting. And then came the email. From the president of MIT herself. It was simple, direct, and breathtaking. Subject: an invitation to create. Ruby, we've been watching, learning and listening. The time has come not just to honor your voice, but to amplify it. We would like to offer you the directorship of a newly proposed mathematics innovation lab. You will have full autonomy, a research budget, and access to global collaborators. The only requirement: build the space you never had. For the minds like yours, still in the shadows. Ruby stared at the screen, motionless. Her own lab. Not a borrowed board.
Not a discarded desk.
A space designed for her to build, not beg. She walked to her window, overlooking the Boston skyline, and whispered the sentence aloud. My own lab. It didn't feel like a prize. It felt like a reckoning. She thought of her grandmother's kitchen, where she'd first learned to divide numbers by counting beans. Thought of the janitor's closet, where she'd solved problems in the dark. Thought of every erased chalkboard, every glance that doubted her, every voice that laughed when she asked a question. And now, a lab, with her name on the door, not to prove them wrong, to make sure they never buried another Ruby again. The official name of the lab wasn't chosen by MIT, it was chosen by Ruby, and when the plaque was revealed, it made the room fall silent. The Department of Uncredentialed Genius, because brilliance never needed permission. But outside, someone was watching the ceremony from a distance. A former colleague of Klein's, and in his hand was a flash drive labeled replication file, original source code, not hers, because someone somewhere still wasn't ready to let her win. The air inside the new facility hummed with quiet energy, not from machinery or polished servers, but from minds waking up. Officially it was called the Department of Uncredentialed Genius, but everyone just called it the Legacy Lab. No plaques with donor names, no admission exams, no uniform expectations. The only requirement: you had to be overlooked. Here, there were no SAT scores, no AP transcripts, no polished recommendation letters from prep schools. Only handwritten notes, raw problem solving, or whispered genius that had never found a microphone. Ruby Whittaker stood at the center of the atrium on the lab's opening day, surrounded by the soft hum of voices. Teenage boys with ankle monitors trading proofs with girls who had dropped out of school to care for younger siblings, now solving multidimensional geometry like it was breathwork. Each one of them was a version of who Ruby had been: brilliant, underestimated, invisible. Every corner of the lab echoed that truth. The chalkboards were painted into the walls. Blank notebooks sat on every surface. The janitorial cart that once held Ruby's notebook now stood at the entrance, repurposed as a mobile math station for any student who wanted to work while pacing. They called it the Cart of Discovery. Ruby never lectured from a podium. She walked among them, asking questions, listening to how they saw the world. She had created a space where brilliance didn't need to be fluent in Latin or wear pressed collars. And every student was given the one thing she never got: belief. There was Elijah, a 16-year-old from Atlanta, who once flunked out of algebra but had an uncanny ability to model climate patterns with fractals. And Naya, a housing shelter resident who, without ever attending high school, discovered an original proof of rotational symmetry using only public library books. They didn't call her Professor Whittaker, they just called her Ruby. And one of them, Marcus, showed up wearing old, squeaky janitor shoes. She had asked him quietly one morning, "You know you can wear anything here, right?" He looked up, smiled, and said, "I'm not wearing these because I have to. I'm wearing them because you did." Ruby didn't cry, but she wrote his name in the front of her new notebook. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build while you're still here. One afternoon, Elise visited the lab, watching from the back wall as Ruby broke down a complex proof using old laundry detergent bottles as visual aids. She turned shock dust into revolution, Elise whispered. Ruby waved her over during break, her hands smudged with ink. "They're terrifying," she said, grinning. "Every one of them is 5 steps ahead of where I was." "They're not terrifying," Elise replied. "They're free." Ruby looked around at the open notebooks, the student debates, the walls filled with chaotic brilliance, and nodded. But that peace wouldn't last long, because brilliance may silence doubt, but it also draws shadows. 3 weeks after the lab opened, a brown envelope appeared at Ruby's door.
No name.
Just a logo. Averline and Bishop Legal Consultancy. Inside, a letter, brief, cold, direct. "It has come to our attention that several concepts attributed to Ms. Whittaker are under question in a forthcoming audit by the National Academic Integrity Board, based on a source code replication claim. You are advised to prepare representation." Ruby's fingers froze. Source code? The old whisper returned, not hers. Attached to the letter was a digital download key for a drive. She plugged it into her laptop cautiously. What opened was a technical document, dense, coded, annotated, lines of logic, but not hers. And yet, they mimicked her proofs, almost eerily. Then she saw it. The metadata. The author listed, T. Levington. Date stamped 6 months prior to her first televised solution. Impossible. He'd fabricated a digital record to frame her work as derivative. Except he was gone. He had resigned. Publicly. Admitted her genius. So who submitted this? A second file on the drive answered that question. Forwarded emails between Levington and a former research assistant, James Rydell. The assistant Ruby had once seen outside the archive, eavesdropping when she solved a proof alone. He had copied her notebook that night. She remembered the quiet panic in his eyes, the way he vanished the moment she turned. Now he was trying to rewrite the narrative. She paced the lab floor, mind racing. She had built a sanctuary, but old ghosts had found their way in. Elise, she called. Elise answered within minutes. I thought Levington was done. He is, Ruby said, but he left behind disciples. They met in the lab's back room that evening. Elise pored over the documents, her jaw tightening. They've restructured your work using reverse logic and are trying to pass it off as prior art. It's smart. It's dirty. But it won't hold. Ruby's voice was low, but it's familiar. That's the part that hurts. It's not just an attack on me. It's an attempt to poison what I'm building.
Then we fight it.
No, Ruby said. We expose it. In the way they can't predict. She didn't want another courtroom. She wanted a confrontation. One that couldn't be buried under academic jargon or silenced in polished faculty lounges. That night, she sent a single email to her entire network. Students, professors, allies, media, subject open defense. You're invited to watch me prove it again, live. Because if they wanted to challenge her origin, she'd give them a front row seat to her mind. In real time, with the world watching. The buzz in the lab hadn't stopped since Ruby announced the open defense. The global live stream was scheduled for the next morning, and anticipation pulsed through every hallway, every whispered equation, every freshly scribbled whiteboard. Students tuned their proofs like musicians tuning instruments, each of them electrified by the idea that the world would soon watch brilliance unfold in real time. But before the cameras, before the eyes of academia turned their gaze again, someone returned through the doors who hadn't earned the right to be there. Professor Thomas Levington. He arrived without announcement, without entourage, wearing a wrinkled blazer that no longer fit quite right, and shoes too polished for a man who looked that tired. Time had taken some of his arrogance, softened his shoulders, hollowed his cheeks, but there was still something sharp in his eyes, not cruelty, but discomfort, regret with edges. Ruby saw him before the students did. He stepped into the atrium, just as Marcus, the student in janitor shoes, was explaining a complex proof to two visitors. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. Whispers ripped. Levington stood motionless. Then, is she here? Ruby emerged from a side hallway, calm, clipboard in hand. The students watched as she approached him. He cleared his throat, voice dry. Ruby. She said nothing. I suppose you know why I'm here. Ruby studied him. She hadn't seen him in person since before the resignation, before the leak, before the apology masked in silence. He looked smaller now. Not physically, spiritually, like a man who finally realized how much history had moved on without him. I do, she said. He nodded. I saw your announcement. Most people did. I came to... He stopped, corrected himself. I don't have the right words. I don't even know if I have the right to speak here. Her voice was calm. Then why did you come? He swallowed. To see what I failed to recognize. To face what I helped bury. I needed to stand in the place I tried to erase. The students listened without pretending not to. Some took quiet notes. Not of the math, but the moment. Ruby turned slightly, gesturing to the room. You thought all this would never happen, she said. You taught students to contain minds like mine. You weren't just complicit. You were deliberate. He didn't deny it. He looked at the chalkboard nearest him, covered in fresh notations from a 15-year-old student who hadn't spoken a full sentence the day she arrived. I was wrong, he said simply. Ruby held his gaze. Her voice dropped, not in anger but in clarity. You were never my enemy, she said, loud enough for every student to hear. My silence was. Gasps rippled. Not because the line was dramatic, but because it was true, and it was her confession too. For years she had hidden brilliance like contraband, had let herself shrink into corners and closets. Her silence, taught by survival, had also let predators like Levington thrive unchecked. But now? Now her voice filled rooms. And this time, so did her presence. Levington's shoulders slumped as though her words released something he'd been carrying for years. Maybe even decades. I've lost everything, he whispered. Tenure. Reputation. The students I mentored. They don't return my calls. Ruby didn't soften. What you lost was your reflection. What you kept hidden finally caught up. He looked around once more. At the students, the vibrance, the legacy unfolding without him. I have nothing left to offer here, he said. Ruby stepped forward, then did something no one expected. She handed him a notebook. A blank one. Start again, she said. But this time, listen more than you write. Levington blinked. You'd allow me to. No lectures. No teaching. Just learning. Sit in the back. Be the student you refused to believe I was. Stunned silence held the room. It wasn't forgiveness. It was accountability. An invitation to redemption. Not absolution. He took the notebook with shaking hands. I will, he said. She nodded once and turned, heading back into the heart of the lab. The students swarmed her, questions rushing forward. But she held up a hand. Tomorrow, she said. Everything happens tomorrow. But as she entered her office, she found an envelope on her desk, unmarked, no postage. Inside, a single piece of paper. Don't prove it. Protect it. They're coming for the lab next. The morning of the live stream, the sky over Cambridge was pale with low-hanging fog, the kind that made the world feel quiet and waiting. Inside the Legacy Lab, the lights buzzed gently, the air charged with anticipation. Cameras were in place, students gathered along the walls and stairwells, screens blinked from universities around the world, ready to witness the moment Ruby Whittaker would solve live, the proof she had once scribbled alone in chalk, the one they now claimed was never hers. But Ruby stood still. In her office, she clutched the anonymous note left the night before. Don't prove it. Protect it. They're coming for the lab next. She stared at the words, her breath shallow. It wasn't paranoia. It was warning. The systems that had once tried to erase her were now trying to absorb her, and everything she built. The fear wasn't that she would be wrong. It was that she would become too powerful for them to ignore, but too radical for them to control. Elise entered quietly, sensing her hesitation. They're watching, she said gently. Ruby nodded. I know, but you don't owe them anything, Elise added. You've already won. Ruby looked at the board behind her, filled with markings only she could make sense of. Curves and crossings that danced like a language never fully translated. It wasn't just math. It was memory. Resistance. Legacy. I'm not doing this to prove I'm right, she said. I'm doing it so the next kid like me never has to. Minutes later, she stepped onto the platform. No podium. No script. Just her and the board. The room hushed.
Millions tuned in.
And Ruby began to write.
Not fast. Not for show.
She wrote like someone who had solved the problem long ago, but was taking her time because she wanted the world to understand, not just the answer, but the journey. She narrated every line in her quiet, deliberate voice, broke down each barrier the same way she had broken down doors her whole life, patiently, unshakably. In 47 minutes, the proof was complete. There was no applause, just stunned silence. And then, a tidal wave of reaction. Professors from France to Brazil posted public acknowledgments. A Nobel Prize winner tweeted, I've waited 30 years to see someone approach math this way. Ivy League journals began issuing corrections, retroactively crediting her methods. MIT offered to name a lecture hall in her honor, but none of that compared to what happened a week later. Harvard, after years of deflection and silence, issued a formal letter. They admitted the oversight, admitted the plagiarism, admitted the systemic failure to recognize her mind, her voice, her presence, and they did something no one expected. They offered her a permanent faculty position. Ruby declined, but she sent back a request of her own. Not for a statue, not for a scholarship in her name, just a plaque, one line, one location. The plaque was installed quietly, without ceremony. It read, Ruby Whittaker solved the unsolvable here. And it wasn't placed in a lecture hall, or a lobby, or a marble corridor. It was installed in the janitor's closet of room 4C, the place where her story began, beneath mop buckets and ammonia, between silence and chalk dust, because Ruby wanted that space to matter. Because the next Ruby might not start in a lab. She might start where no one's looking. And when she does, Ruby's name will be there. Not to inspire but to remind her, you were never the problem. They were never ready. The Legacy Lab expanded to 3 campuses by the end of the year. Ruby began publishing her curriculum, not in elite journals, but as open-access PDFs, free to every student with internet. Her notebooks were digitized, translated into 9 languages. She hosted fireside math talks in shelters, libraries, even prisons. One night, during an event in a community center in Newark, a young girl approached her with trembling hands. "I don't think like the other kids," she whispered. Ruby knelt down. "Neither did I." The girl handed her a page, a solution to a complex problem she'd never been taught. Ruby smiled. "Where'd you learn this?" "I didn't," she said. "It just made sense." Ruby nodded. "That's how you know it's real." As Ruby stood to leave, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. A voice message. Just 3 words. "She's not done." Because the system she dismantled was already regrouping. And this time it wasn't just after her. It was after everyone like her. If you've ever been overlooked, silenced, or told you don't belong, this story was for you. Because Ruby's fight isn't just hers. It's every quiet genius they tried to ignore. Every dream scrubbed away before it could speak. Type yes if you believe brilliance has no uniform. Subscribe if this broke your heart and opened your eyes.